What's good, YouTube? Welcome back. Thank you for clicking onto this reaction. I hope you're looking forward to it just as much as I am. If you haven't already, head over to the content creators page. That link is in the description box down below. If you haven't already and you're enjoying our content, you know what you need to do. You need to like, comment, subscribe, hit that notification bell, but we're going to jump straight into this one. World War II, The Resource War, Land-Lease, Extra History, Episode 2. Let's go.
#2.
The year is 1941. World War II is entering its third year. France has collapsed, and Great Britain is barely holding on. A last bulwark of democracy against the tide of fascism. Dictatorship rules Europe, and the sleeping giant of the United States has yet to wake. With the collapse of France in 1940, the situation in Europe becomes clear. Without resources from the US, all resistance to the Nazi military machine would collapse, no matter how bravely the small island nation of Britain tried to hold out. But America was opposed to war. In fact, it goes further. America was opposed to any intervention at all. In the 1930s, the US had passed the Neutrality Act, which not only established that it wasn't going to get involved with foreign wars, but went further with the prevailing American isolationism of the time and declared that America wasn't going to sell arms to nations at war. President Roosevelt saw the threat that Nazi Germany posed and desperately wanted to find ways to support the British war effort, but the Neutrality Acts kept his hands tied. When Czechoslovakia fell, he lobbied Congress to renew an old provision in the Neutrality Act called cash and carry, but his efforts were rebuffed. Then Poland fell, and things started to look grim. Finally, on November 5th, 1939, cash and carry was renewed. But cash and carry was a limited provision. It allowed for the sale of material to Britain and France, but only if they paid in cash for the material and transported it all back to Europe themselves. No one was to enter a war zone. At first, this worked, but as the years dragged on and France fell, Britain found itself hemorrhaging its reserves. The Battle of Britain and the campaigning in North Africa had been bleeding it dry. There simply was no more cash in the UK, and even the British fleet was being stretched thin. In 1940, Roosevelt established a policy allowing the trade of destroyers to the British in exchange for bases in British colonies. This policy was definitely pushing the limits of the Neutrality Act, but technically it wasn't violating the terms of cash and carry because the British were trading for the ships rather than buying them. And hey, ships do a pretty good job of transporting themselves, so there you go. This deal really shows the desperation of the situation, though. Roosevelt risked a potentially illegal action because everyone, his staff, and even much of the British staff saw the capitulation of the British Empire as inevitable. In 1940, everyone thought Britain was on the ropes, mere weeks from being taken down. And so, as a last Hail Mary, this destroyers for bases deal put US bases on British colonies so that they wouldn't simply fall into Nazi hands. But fortunately, the Battle of Britain was won, and now the US had to enter into more long-term thinking. It was time for Lend-Lease. This is one of the critical turning points in the Second World War. It's right up there with the German invasion of the Soviet Union and the United States finally deciding to fully commit to war. Without Lend-Lease, the UK almost certainly would have fallen. Fascists would gain control over all of Europe, and even if the US later decided to enter the war, they'd have no jumping off point for a European campaign. But Lend-Lease at last meant that the complete industrial power of the US would be committed to combating the Nazi war machine. With Lend-Lease, the US had finally picked a side. You see, the idea behind Lend-Lease was simple. The US would give its strategic partners, and I say strategic partners because they're not allies yet, massive amounts of war material for the duration of the war, after which these strategic partners were supposed to give that material back. Funny thing about war material, though, not a lot of it tends to come back in the same condition you lent it out in. And the US knew this. This was essentially the largest donation of war material in the history of mankind. And it wasn't just tanks and bombs. It was foodstuffs and telephone cabling. It was trucks and clothing. Heck, the US even shipped 2,000 locomotives and 11,000 train cars over to the USSR to bolster their rail infrastructure. This was a huge portion of the US economy going to cover the material cost of the war while other nations were carrying the bulk of the human cost. And the sheer size of this effort is indescribable. It helped to drag the US out of the Great Depression and galvanized American production. It meant sending millions of tons overseas, shipping on a scale heretofore unimaginable during times of war. It meant giving away more goods than the entire world would have been able to produce annually a mere 75 years before. But like all things, this decision wasn't as straightforward as we sometimes like to think of it. Looking back on it today, it's easy to see the results of this Herculean task and how fully America threw herself into the effort, and just assume that the entire nation was unified behind this cause, that it had broad support. But democracy...
But of course they had, like, because of World War One, they had that treaty saying that they were going to be isolated, so of course there were certain people that weren't happy.
Are, by design, messy things. And even on the issue of Lend-Lease, voting in the US Congress was split almost exactly down party lines. But once the measure was passed, America really did embrace this decision to truly be the arsenal of democracy, to be the engine of war for the anti-fascist world. And that leads me to a particular group I'd like to talk about. A group who's too rarely remembered and celebrated. A group whose battles were rarely glorious. They never took cities or gained territory, but they're the group of Americans who risked their lives earliest and sacrificed the most. They had higher casualty percentages than any of the other American armed services during the war, and they, very arguably, saved the free world. I would like to take this moment to acknowledge the service of the Merchant Marine. These are the men and women who serve as sailors to transport goods during wartime. They served in unarmed civilian ships, hauling necessary supplies to Allied forces throughout the war. Sailing the Atlantic, every day they faced the harrowing dread of the submarine. At any moment, they might lose their lives to an unseen and invisible vessel far below the waves. They served simply as prey, unable to fight back against an enemy that might at any time strike without warning. To die asphyxiating in a steel tomb or freezing in the unforgiving waters of the Atlantic are horrors that no one would want to face, and yet these sailors...
No, I wouldn't want to face that. You see those photos of the fucking boat where it's been like fucking torpedoed and it starts sinking like that? Imagine being stuck in the boat and it's... Oh, brother. Oh, it's just like being in a submersible, isn't it?
Yeah. Do that.
Oh yeah, you just go pay 250 grand to do that, you know?
faced that every day, not for glory, but simply because it was a job that needed to be done. And these threats were so real and omnipresent that the Merchant Marine became one of the first uses of statistical operations research. The frequency of attacks on the Merchant Marine presented enough data for decisions to be made about the optimal size of a convoy and the escort it might require. Evidence all gathered off the backs of broken ships and drowned sailors. But despite all of this, many of the men and women of the Merchant Marine signed up for voyage after voyage, returning to the seas to make sure that the material of Lend-Lease always got through. And though the U.S. wouldn't officially enter the war for 9 more months, Lend-Lease made members of the Merchant Marine some of the first U.S. citizens to give their lives for the Allied cause in World War II. And in doing so, though their sacrifice is rarely celebrated, they helped change the course of history. Join us next week as we look more closely at how the lack of specific natural resources drove Axis policy, and explore how many of the synthetic products we know today came to be during the Second World War.
Well, I'm definitely looking forward to finding out what that is, and so is Jack. If you haven't already, head over to Extra History, Extra Credits page. That link's in the description box down below. If you're enjoying our content, you know what you need to do. Like, comment, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and we will catch you in the next video.
Shot of cream.